In October 1962, the Soviet Union's plan to arm Cuba with nuclear weapons almost ended the world as we know it, as American schoolchildren prepared to hide under their desks as if that would protect them in a nuclear war. The start of World War II was narrowly averted on October 28, 1962. Ever since, nuclear weapons have remained a reality in geopolitics, but more than anything as a tool of dissuasion. The concept of mutually assured destruction meant that neither the US nor the USSR would use nukes because their adversary would annihilate them in a chain reaction ending in the destruction of the planet. Today, the fear of a nuclear war seems more real than it ever has since 1962. On one hand, Russia's official nuclear weapons policy is only to use nukes as a deterrent in a few very specific scenarios. These include attacking Russia or an ally's territory with ballistic missiles, nuclear weapons, or other WMDs, attacking Russian facilities that endanger its nuclear capabilities, or aggression against the Russian state with conventional weapons when its very existence is in jeopardy. On the other hand, Vladimir Putin has openly threatened to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine in March, and now again in September 2022. His speech on September 21st included the threat to use, quote, all available means to protect Russia and our people if Russia's territorial integrity was threatened, adding, quote, this is not a bluff. Ever since the war in Ukraine started, when you ask experts whether Putin would really fire nukes in Ukraine, you get a lot of different answers. Some claim that Putin could use nukes as a last resort to preserve his regime, while others say that it's just a bluff, like the threats he made in March when the invasion of Kiev didn't go according to plan. Or in 2014 during the invasion of Crimea. One theory is that he's using an escalate to de-escalate strategy, meaning he threatens an extreme measure like nuclear weapons to get his adversary to back down. His latest speech has drawn a variety of reactions. The Institute for the Study of War, a think tank focused on conflict, said in their daily analysis of the Ukraine conflict that, quote, Putin emphatically did not say that the Russian nuclear umbrella would cover annexed areas of Ukraine. On the other hand, the New York Times stated the opposite, claiming the Kremlin was implying that, quote, Ukrainian counteroffensives to recapture territory seized by Russia would be considered attacks on Russian soil, justifying any level of retaliation up to and including a nuclear response. So which one is it? Well, former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev, who now has a top seat on Russia's Security Council, has given us an answer. Medvedev said outright that the territories Russia is trying to annex into Russia will, quote, be entitled to protection from Russian nuclear weapons. While Russia doesn't have full control of any of the regions it has invaded this year, its recent defeats in the northeast of Kharkiv Oblast have pushed it to organize a sham referendum in occupied territories the weekend of September 24th, 2022. Just like when it annexed Crimea in 2014, Russia will hold an election in the areas it has invaded with no credible international oversight and likely with armed guards pressuring a pro-Russian vote. While Western countries will definitely not recognize the results of this election, they are powerless to stop it from happening and thus to stop Russia from using the referendum as an excuse to use nukes. So let's get to the question you've been waiting for. What happens if Russia follows through on its nuclear threats? According to Eric Schlosser, author of Command and Control, Nuclear Weapons, there are 4 potential scenarios for Russia to use nukes in Ukraine. His first scenario is detonating a nuke over the Black Sea, sending a strong signal without causing casualties. The second one is to target Ukraine's president Volodymyr Zelensky and his advisors. This would make it easier for Putin to install a puppet regime in Ukraine, but would not be seen as legitimate by other countries, especially since a nuke would be involved. Third, using nukes against a military target while attempting to avoid harming civilians. This scenario seems unlikely, as Russia has already committed massive atrocities against civilians, like the recently discovered torture and murder of innocent Ukrainians in the city of Izium. Finally, Schlosser suggests that Russia would nuke an entire Ukrainian city to force a surrender, like the US did to Japan in World War II. See, Russia has the world's largest nuclear arsenal, including a triad of long-range ballistic missiles stored in strategic bombers, land missiles, and sea-based missiles. They also have a smaller number of short-range nukes which could be used on the battlefield. Schlosser points out that Russia's short-range tactical nukes will have to be transported to military bases before they're ready to use, which would be visible by satellite surveillance, so the US and NATO would be aware ahead of time. When you consider that modern nuclear warheads are orders of magnitude more destructive than those used in the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, it seems more logical that Russia would use small tactical nukes. Since, according to one expert Schlosser interviewed, Putin wouldn't nuke territory he wants to claim. Schlosser proposed these 4 scenarios in an article for The Atlantic magazine this July, but the situation has changed since then. In August, Russia started using the, and excuse me for butchering this name, Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which it has occupied since March, as a military base. Despite warnings that it could spark a nuclear meltdown, shelling continues at Europe's largest nuclear power plant. The head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Rafael Mariano Grossi, said after visiting the plant that he believed the power lines were being deliberately targeted. If this is true, it would make Vladimir Putin one of the most evil, calculating people to ever walk the planet. If the plant loses power for too long, it could cause a nuclear meltdown, making the plant into a new kind of nuclear weapon. Currently, the plant has actually been shut down, but still needs some electricity to pump water to cool down its reactors. The pump can usually be powered by incoming electric power lines, but since these have been cut, the plant has to run on one of its 6 reactors in a low power mode to keep electricity flowing to the cooling and safety systems. But the plant isn't designed to function like this for long, so it also has several emergency diesel generators with enough fuel for up to 10 days. According to nuclear engineer Stephen Nesbitt, if the worst happens and the plant runs out of power, causing a meltdown, it probably won't be as bad as Fukushima, since the plant has had some time to cool down. He also said that a scenario like Chernobyl is impossible, since that involved unique conditions that can't be replicated in this situation. As a final reassurance, there is a containment building surrounding the plant that could prevent the plant from releasing radiation into the atmosphere. But that, of course, is assuming that it isn't damaged by the fighting. Still, while the fears of a massive nuclear meltdown might be overblown, that's not the point of occupying the nuclear plant. If you think about how the Fukushima disaster, an improbable event caused by a tsunami in Japan, caused Germany to abandon nuclear energy altogether, it's not a stretch to imagine Putin exploiting the fear of a new nuclear disaster to drive Europe back to purchasing Russian gas. While it remains to be seen whether the occupation of this nuclear plant is just a fear-mongering tactic or a real threat, I think this is the most likely nuclear scenario for Russia to use in Ukraine. The irony of Russia using nukes in Ukraine is that during the Soviet Union, many of Russia's nukes were stored there. It was only in 1994 that Ukraine gave up its nukes in exchange for assurances that Russia or NATO wouldn't use nukes against Ukraine as part of an agreement called the Budapest Memorandum. After the terrifying climax of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the US and Soviet Union slowly pursued nuclear arms reduction for decades. Starting in the 1970s, the United States and the Soviet Union started negotiating reductions to their nuclear stockpiles, starting with the Strategic Arms Limitation talks, and leading to the most recent New START Treaty, which Russia's parliament ratified in January 2011, just after the US Senate. These treaties include mutual inspections, which means a team of American nuclear inspectors to inspect nuclear weapon sites and make sure the agreements are being respected and vice versa. The inspections were paused during the pandemic, and in August of this year, Russia suspended US inspectors from visiting indefinitely. Still, Russia continues to notify the US of movements of its nuclear arsenal or any other changes. So if Russia continues to respect the ongoing norms and agreements, it's unlikely they'll use nukes in Ukraine. But that leads us to the final and most unpredictable factor in this calculation: Putin himself. Vladimir Putin has become a pariah in Europe over the past few years, even more so since the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Remember that Putin was a KGB officer during the Cold War, and this experience shaped his worldview even after the Cold War ended. He's even referred to the fall of the Soviet Union as, quote, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Today, he's increasingly paranoid of NATO and surrounded by his yes men, which could result in a dangerous miscalculation. How do you convince someone living in their own world not to use nukes? It's really unpredictable, and what's scary is how out of hand things could get. So considering all of this, how should the US respond to a Russian nuclear attack without provoking World War III? While geopolitical experts suggest a variety of responses like retaliating with conventional weapons instead of nukes, the real challenge is giving an appropriate response without provoking further escalation. That's why the Biden administration has been purposely ambiguous about the consequences for using nuclear weapons. They want to scare Russia out of carrying a nuclear attack in the first place. The Pentagon's Nuclear Posture Review states that, quote, Russia must understand that nuclear first use will fail to achieve its objectives and trigger incalculable and intolerable costs for Moscow. But when you get into the details of what punishment the US would deliver, it's not clear, and that's on purpose. If they're vague about the details of the consequences of using nuclear weapons, the Russians would be more hesitant, and the Americans avoid giving away their playbook. But where the war goes from here and whether Russia becomes the second country to use nukes in wartime remains to be seen. But that's it for this video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.